I caught my stepson in the shower, and what happened next changed everything. What do you do when a moment of weakness threatens to destroy the life you've built? Stay tuned to find out how one forbidden moment blurred every line I swore I'd never cross. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I caught Ryan in the shower, and what I saw left me questioning everything. The bathroom was filled with the thick scent of steam and the rhythmic sound of water hitting the tiled floor. I'd knocked twice, but when there was no answer, I assumed Ryan couldn't hear me over the shower. Mark was always telling me how much water Ryan wasted, so I decided to open the door just enough to tell him dinner was ready. But I hadn't expected this. Through the frosted glass of the shower door, Ryan's outline was illuminated by the bathroom light, every movement more defined than I was prepared for. My stepson's figure, once awkward and lanky as a teenager, was now that of a young man. He was standing there, his back turned to me, but I could see his arm moving, almost methodically, down his body. The innocence of what I thought I'd see shattered in that moment, replaced by something far more complicated. I froze, unsure whether to clear my throat, step back, or pretend I hadn't walked in at all. But in my hesitation, my foot nudged the door slightly, and the sound made him turn his head sharply. "Julie?" His voice cracked with embarrassment, his hand instantly flying up to cover himself as best he could. "What the hell? I thought I locked the door." I knocked," I stammered, my face instantly heating. "You didn't answer, so I thought, oh, God, I'm so sorry." My eyes darted away, but not before the image burned itself into my memory. I reached for the door handle, fumbling in my haste to close it, but my hand trembled as my brain raced to catch up with what had just happened. "Can you just go?" His voice was muffled, tinged with frustration, and I didn't blame him. "Yes, of course, I didn't mean to. I trailed off, finally pulling the door shut behind me. I stood there for a moment in the hallway, my back against the door, willing my pulse to slow. My heart was pounding, not just from the embarrassment, but from something else I couldn't quite name, something that made my chest tighten and my skin tingle in a way I hadn't felt in years. What had I just done? Dinner was forgotten as I retreated to the living room, hoping to find solace in mindless television. But the scene replayed in my mind with an intensity that unnerved me. The thought of facing him at the dinner table made my stomach twist. What would I say? How could I look him in the eye after that? The worst part wasn't what I saw, it was how it made me feel. Something I had no business feeling. I told myself it was nothing. A moment of awkwardness, a misunderstanding. I convinced myself it was just the shock of walking in on him. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning I woke up, hoping to brush the previous evening under the rug. I convinced myself it had been a fleeting moment, one born out of awkwardness and surprise, not something worth dwelling on. Yet, as I went about my usual routine, making coffee, tidying up the kitchen, I found my thoughts circling back to it. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the way my mind lingered on Ryan's outline behind the frosted glass, the way my pulse quickened despite my better judgment. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. This was ridiculous. I was Ryan's stepmother, not some hormonal teenager. Whatever I was feeling, it wasn't real. It was just a reaction to loneliness, to the isolation I'd been carrying in this marriage for far too long. My husband, Mark, had been gone for almost 2 weeks on yet another business trip, leaving me to manage the house and Ryan on my own. Not that Ryan needed managing. At 22, he was independent and responsible. But there was a distance between us, a formality that had never quite lifted since I'd married his father 5 years ago. I wasn't his mom, and he made sure I never forgot it. "Morning." Ryan's voice broke through my thoughts as he walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a fresh shower. I tensed involuntarily, the memory of the previous night flooding back. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Thanks," he said, pouring himself a mug. He leaned against the counter, taking a sip. "About last night." I froze, my breath hitching. He was bringing it up. Why was he bringing it up? I didn't mean to snap at you," he continued, his eyes flicking up to meet mine briefly. "It's just, well, yeah, it was embarrassing." "Oh, Ryan, please," I said quickly, waving my hand as if to brush the whole thing away. "You don't have to explain. I shouldn't have barged in." "No, it's fine," he said, his tone softening. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." Uncomfortable? That wasn't the word I would have chosen. "It's forgotten," I lied, forcing a smile. "Let's not make a big deal out of it." He nodded, his expression relaxing. "Cool, thanks." With that, he grabbed his coffee and headed to the living room, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. If he could let it go, so could I. The day unfolded as uneventfully as any other, but the tension lingered beneath the surface. I busied myself with errands, grocery shopping, and a long overdue cleaning of the guest bedroom. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But every so often I'd catch myself wondering what Ryan was doing in the next room, or noticing the faint traces of his cologne in the air as I passed the hallway. By evening, I felt the weight of my emotions pressing harder. Loneliness was a constant companion in my marriage, but lately it had taken on a sharper edge. Mark's absences had grown longer, his calls shorter. When he did call, it was all business, logistics about bills, updates on his meetings, and a quick "love you" before hanging up. The warmth, the connection we once had faded into a shadow of itself. And Ryan was different. Though we weren't close, his presence filled the house in a way Mark's never did. He had an easy charm, a quick wit that occasionally slipped out during dinner conversations, and an earnestness that reminded me of how things used to feel when Mark and I first started dating. But that was absurd. Ryan wasn't Mark. He was my stepson, and I had no right to compare them. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't help but steal glances at him across the table. He looked tired, his hair slightly disheveled, but there was a quiet confidence about him that I found disarming. He caught me looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Nothing," I said, quickly looking down at my plate. "You just seem distracted." He shrugged. "Just thinking about school stuff. I've got finals coming up." "Anything I can help with?" I offered, more out of habit than genuine intent. His smirk softened into something closer to a smile. "Nah, I've got it. But thanks." We ate in companionable silence after that, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. I told myself it was fine. Everything was fine. But the knot in my chest refused to loosen. The days turned into a pattern of avoidance and subtle interactions. Ryan spent most of his time in his room or at the library, and I threw myself into housework and hobbies. But the space between us only seemed to amplify the tension. One evening, the power went out during a storm. The house was plunged into darkness, and I fumbled around for candles while Ryan came downstairs, his phone flashlight guiding his way. "Need help?" he asked, his voice cutting through the dim. "Yeah," I said, grateful for the distraction. "Check the drawer by the fridge. There should be some candles in there." He found them quickly and helped me light them, the flickering flames casting warm shadows across the kitchen. For the first time in days, we found ourselves talking. Really talking. He told me about his plans after graduation, his frustrations with his dad, and his dreams of moving to the city to start fresh. "I just feel like I'm stuck," he admitted, his voice low. "Like I'm supposed to have everything figured out, but I don't." His vulnerability caught me off guard. "Ryan, nobody has everything figured out," I said gently. "You're allowed to feel lost. It's part of growing up." Before I really let go of his hands, I stared at his face and felt something. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine in the candlelight. "Do you ever feel that way? Like you're stuck?" I hesitated, his question striking closer to home than I was comfortable admitting. "Sometimes," I said finally. "But you figure it out as you go. You find ways to keep moving forward." "Oh," he nodded, but his gaze lingered a moment longer, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. I looked away, pretending to adjust one of the candles. "Thanks," he said after a pause, "for saying that." "Any time," I replied, forcing a smile. "Now, let's hope the power comes back before we burn the house down." He laughed, the tension breaking, but the moment stayed with me long after the lights came back on. The morning after the storm, the house felt quieter than usual. The faint buzz of electricity had returned, but something about the previous night lingered in the air, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. Ryan was already out by the time I came downstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he muttered something about a study group. I nodded, offering him a quick smile, but my mind was elsewhere. I had spent most of the night turning over our conversation in my head, the way his voice had softened when he spoke of feeling stuck, the vulnerable edge to his tone. It was like seeing a part of him I hadn't known existed. But it wasn't just his words that haunted me. It was the way he'd looked at me, as though searching for something only I could provide. I buried myself in chores, hoping to shake the thoughts free. Laundry, dishes, vacuuming, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of his eyes lingered, pulling at threads I couldn't afford to unravel. By the time Ryan came home that evening, the sky was a deep shade of indigo, and the house was bathed in the soft glow of lamps. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the front door creak open, followed by the sound of his keys hitting the counter. "Hey," he called out, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Smells good." "Lasagna," I replied, glancing over my shoulder. "Figured you could use something hearty with all the studying you've been doing." He walked into the kitchen, his hair slightly damp from the rain outside. "You didn't have to go all out," he said, but there was a warmth in his voice that made me smile. "I didn't," I lied, pulling the pan from the oven. "It's just easy." We sat down to eat, the clinking of forks against plates filling the silence. It was a comfortable rhythm, one I had grown to appreciate in Mark's absence. Ryan, despite his occasional aloofness, had a way of grounding the house, making it feel less empty. "You're quiet tonight," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His eyes met mine, and I felt the air shift. "Just tired," I replied, averting my gaze. "Busy day." "You've been tired a lot lately," he said, his tone almost teasing, but laced with genuine concern. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing against the fragile wall I'd built around my thoughts. "I'm fine," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Just the usual." He nodded, but didn't press further. Yet as we continued eating, I could feel his gaze flicker toward me, as though trying to decipher a puzzle he didn't quite understand. Standing back up, he looked out toward the beach where the water was just beginning to surge. The tension reached a breaking point a few days later. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I was in the living room, curled up with a book I hadn't really been reading, when Ryan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, closing the book. "Yeah," he said, stepping further into the room. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not," I said, gesturing to the couch. He sank into the cushions, his proximity unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. We sat in silence for a moment, the faint glow of the lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Then, without warning, he spoke. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, like you're just going through the motions, doing what's expected of you, but it doesn't feel real," he said, his eyes fixed on the coffee table. "Like you're not really you." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into my chest. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think everyone feels that way at some point." He looked at me then, his gaze intense. "What do you do about it?" I hesitated, the truth too complicated to put into words. "You find something that makes you feel alive," I said finally. "Something that reminds you who you are." "And if you can't?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can," I said, my own voice soft. The room fell silent again, but this time, the quiet was heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the space between us shrinking, the air thick with something neither of us dared name. The next day, I resolved to create distance. Whatever was happening, whatever I thought I felt, it wasn't right. I was the adult, the parent figure. It was my responsibility to set boundaries, to keep things from crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But distance was easier said than done. Ryan seemed to sense the shift, his behavior oscillating between confusion and frustration. He would linger in the kitchen longer than necessary, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. At dinner, he would steer the conversation toward memories of his childhood, as though trying to bridge the gap between us. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, he walked in and sat on the arm of the couch. "Are you mad at me?" he asked, his tone unusually direct. I wasn't answer. "What? No, of course not," I said, startled by the question. "Then what is it?" he pressed. "You've been different." I set down the shirt I was folding, meeting his gaze. "I'm not mad at you, Ryan. I'm just tired. That's all." He smiled and nodded. His expression softened, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. "You're a terrible liar," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lip. I laughed despite myself, the tension breaking for a moment. But the reprieve was short-lived. As the laughter faded, the weight of the unspoken settled between us once more. I just want things to be okay," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. They are, I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Everything's fine. But as he left the room, I knew neither of us believed it. The days following our conversation were strained, though Ryan didn't press the issue again. I avoided him as much as possible, busying myself with errands, chores, and finding excuses to leave the house. It wasn't just guilt that gnawed at me. It was the fear of what I might feel if I didn't create that distance. Every glance, every moment of silence between us seemed charged with an energy I couldn't control or fully understand. But avoiding him didn't make the problem go away. If anything, it made his presence even more overwhelming. His absence filled the house with a palpable emptiness, and when he was near, I felt like a live wire, crackling with emotions I didn't dare name. He lived with his own mother when my family moved, and the two of them deeply connected. One evening, Mark called from the road. It was a brief, perfunctory conversation, as most of our calls had become. He talked about meetings, travel delays, and how he might not make it back for another week. He barely asked about me, and when he did, it was with a distracted tone that made my heart sink. "Everything's fine," I said, the lie rolling off my tongue effortlessly. "Ryan's been a big help around the house." As I took a sip, "That's good," Mark replied, his voice distant. "I'll check in later. Love you." "Love you too," I murmured, but the words felt hollow as the call disconnected. I set the phone down, staring at it as though it might suddenly provide answers. I had always known Mark's career came first, but I hadn't realized how far down the list I'd fallen. Loneliness wrapped around me like a cold shroud, tightening its grip with each passing day. It was in this state of vulnerability that I found myself one night in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine to drown the ache. The house was quiet save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought I was alone until I turned and saw Ryan standing in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I shook my head, clutching the glass as if it might anchor me. "You?" "Not really," he said, stepping into the room. He hesitated, his eyes scanning my face. "You okay?" I wanted to laugh at the irony of the question, but instead I nodded. "Just tired," I said, the familiar excuse slipping out again. But even I didn't believe it anymore. Ryan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. The way he looked at me, with a mix of concern and something deeper, made my heart race. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said quietly. "Not with me." The vulnerability in his words cut through me, stripping away the last of my defenses. Before I could stop myself, I spoke, my tone a little low. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "With this house, this marriage, this everything." Ryan didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was steady but soft. "It's not your fault." "Isn't it?" I said bitterly, taking a sip of wine to mask the tremor in my voice. "I chose this. I stayed." "Because you care," he said, his tone firm. "Because you're trying to make it work. That doesn't make it your fault." His words hit me harder than I expected, and before I could stop myself, tears welled in my eyes. I turned away, embarrassed by my vulnerability, but Ryan stepped closer, his presence a comforting weight in the room. "You deserve more than this," he said, his voice low. "You deserve to feel alive." The word hung in the air between us, electric and undeniable. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. The space between us felt impossibly small, and I could feel the pull of something I'd been trying to deny for weeks. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, a spark that ignited something I couldn't contain. His touch was hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, the glass of wine forgotten as I placed it on the counter. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about what I was doing, but my body moved of its own accord, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. Yes. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely audible. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my resolve crumbling as our lips met in a tentative, lingering kiss. It was soft at first, almost cautious, but the tension that had been building for weeks exploded. And the kiss deepened. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no house, no mark, no consequences, only the warmth of his touch and the way he made me feel seen, understood, alive. But as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. Ryan stepped back, his expression a mix of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "It's not just you. It's me too. I couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of what we'd done, of what it meant, was too much. Without another word, I turned and fled the room, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom. The next morning, Ryan was gone. A note on the counter said he'd left early to stay with a friend for the weekend. Relief and guilt warred within me as I read it. His absence was a reprieve, a chance to collect myself and figure out what came next. But it also left an ache I couldn't ignore. I spent the weekend in a haze, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. It was wrong, I knew that, but it had also awakened something in me I hadn't felt in years. I hated myself for wanting more, for craving the connection that had blossomed between us. When Ryan returned on Sunday evening, the tension was palpable. We avoided each other at first, speaking only in clipped, polite phrases. But by the time dinner rolled around, the silence was unbearable. "We need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, we do." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to say what needed to be said. "What happened? It can't happen again," I said, my voice steady but soft. "I know," Ryan said, his gaze fixed on the table. "But I don't regret it." His words took me by surprise, and I felt my resolve waver. "Ryan." "I know it was wrong," he said, cutting me off. "But it wasn't meaningless. You can't tell me it didn't mean something to you, too." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "It doesn't matter," I said. "It can't happen." Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Ryan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll respect whatever you decide," he said, his voice soft. "But you deserve to be happy, Julie. Don't forget that." With that, he left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. His words echoed in my mind, a bittersweet reminder of the connection we'd shared and the impossible choices that lay ahead. I sat that night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I realized there were no easy answers. The line between right and wrong had blurred, leaving me lost in a sea of conflicting emotions. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same.